Have you ever heard of a man who rose up to challenge heaven itself? He was not just a king, nor a common conqueror. He was someone who believed he could take the place of the Creator, build an eternal empire, and leave his name engraved above all others. This man was Nimrod, and his story is a living warning of what happens when human pride dares to measure strength against heaven right after the flood, when the earth still bore the scars of the destruction caused by the waters, and the rainbow shone as the sign of the covenant. Many remembered God's promise. Never again will the waters cover the whole earth. But among the descendants of Noah, a generation was born that did not want to trust in that promise. Fear gave way to doubt, and doubt opened the door to rebellion. And in the midst of this people arose Nimrod, a man of uncommon strength and ambition, whose voice drew multitudes. The scriptures describe him as a mighty hunter before the Lord. But his hunt was not limited to wild animals. He hunted men. He hunted hearts. He hunted dominion. And every city he founded, Babel, Erech, Akkad, was another step on the ladder of his pride. Nimrod was not satisfied with ruling. He wanted to be remembered as a god among men. Then came the idea of the tower, a colossal monument designed to touch the heavens, built not as a tribute to the Creator, but as an open challenge to his authority. A fortress against a fear of another flood, a banner of human glory raised before the universe. Let us make a name for ourselves, they said. It was not merely stone upon stone. It was rebellion turned into architecture. It was human pride trying to conquer heaven by force. But there was one detail that changed everything. God looked at that work. The King of the universe stooped down to see the tower men were raising. To human eyes, it looked invincible. To heaven, it was nothing but dust. And what the Lord decided to do there, on the plain of Shinar, changed the history of humanity forever. Yet, this is not only Nimrod's story, it is ours as well. Because even today, we keep building towers, projects rooted in self-reliance, monuments to pride, dreams that exclude the presence of God. And the question remains, how far are you still building towers in your own life? I am so glad you are here. This story goes far beyond the ruins of Babel. It speaks of choices, of trust, of pride, and of faith. So subscribe now to strengthen our community. Leave your comment and join me on this journey. Because what happened on the plain of Shinar may change the way you see your own life today. After the waters of the flood receded and the earth began to bloom again, the rainbow shone in the sky as a living reminder of the divine covenant. Never again will the waters destroy the whole earth. That promise was not just comfort for Noah and his sons. It was the foundation upon which the new generation was meant to build its faith. The rainbow became the first permanent sermon of humanity, a message without words, pointing to the unfailing faithfulness of God. But as the years passed and the children of their children began to multiply, the direct memory of the catastrophe slowly faded. The newer generations had not seen the waters covering mountains and valleys. They had only heard the stories told around campfires. The impact of judgment was gradually replaced by familiarity, and familiarity bred carelessness. In many hearts, reverence gave way to indifference. The rainbow's promise was still in the sky, but it no longer seemed enough for those who desired more security than faith. It was in this setting that Nimrod appeared. Grandson of Ham, great-grandson of Noah, he grew up hearing the stories of the flood. But instead of reverence, he nurtured ambition. Nimrod was different. Strong, fearless, charismatic. Where others sought only to survive, he sought power. Scripture calls him a mighty hunter before the Lord. But his hunt went far beyond wild animals. He hunted hearts. He hunted influence. He hunted dominion. He was not content to live under the promise. He wanted to build something greater than the memory of the rainbow. While many lived scattered, cultivating the land and raising flocks, Nimrod dreamed of centralization. He was the one who laid the foundations of cities like Babel, Erech, and Akkad. His plan was to unite, to organize, to control. He realized that by gathering the people together, he could shape their thoughts, their hopes, and even their faith. Where God had commanded, "Fill the earth," Nimrod declared, "Let us stay together." What looked like wisdom and political vision was, in truth, the seed of rebellion. Nimrod knew how to touch the wound of fear. The stories of the flood were remembered as tragedy, and many still wondered if they could fully trust the promise. All it took was an ambitious leader to turn that doubt into a project. And he did exactly that. If we build a city, if we build a tower, we will be strong. We will not be scattered. We will not depend only on words. That thought began to echo among families, turning doubt into bricks and unbelief into stone. Here lies a truth that crosses time. Whenever man seeks security outside of God, what he builds becomes an idol. Nimrod offered walls instead of faith, stones instead of trust, human glory instead of obedience. He did not want merely to govern. He wanted to be remembered as the founder of greatness that could rival heaven itself. His strength was visible, his ambition contagious, but his leadership was drawing him further and further away from the promise of the rainbow. And he dragged others with him. And here comes a direct reflection. How often do we also prefer a Nimrod who offers us visible solutions instead of resting in the invisible promises of God. How many times do we turn our fears into barriers, our dreams into walls that distance us from true dependence on the Lord? This story is not only theirs, it is also ours. If you are with me up to this point, subscribe to the channel right now. We must build together a community that does not allow itself to be deceived by false securities. And tell me in the comments, from which country and city are you watching? I want to know you and see how far this message is reaching. Back to the story. Nimrod did not stop at planning cities. He began to mold an ideal. A people united around a project that seemed grand but carried within it the poison of disobedience. He presented unity as a virtue, but it was unity against God. With every stone laid, the distance between man and the Creator grew greater. The foundation was being laid, not only on the soil of the plain of Shinar, but in the heart of a generation. The tower had not yet risen, but it already existed in the minds and in the pride of those who dreamed of reaching heaven by their own strength, and what seemed at first only an architectural work would soon reveal itself as the greatest symbol of human rebellion. What was about to unfold would forever mark the history of mankind. Nimrod's name spread through the tents. He was not just the grandson of Ham. He was the man everyone saw as a natural leader. Where others hesitated, he advanced. Where others recalled the words of Noah, he raised up his own plans. The Bible calls him the first mighty one on the earth, and that expression carries weight. He was not simply a ruler. He was the first to transform his personal ambition into empire. The first to use his strength to centralize what was meant to be scattered dot, to be called a mighty hunter before the Lord. Did not merely describe skill with bow and arrows. It was a title laced with irony. Nimrod hunted for dominion over people. He understood that whoever controls the crowd shapes the future. And with his charisma, he began to consolidate his power. The cities he founded were like stone markers of his authority. Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh. Each of them was not only a place of dwelling, but also of control. Nimrod's voice echoed over walls and squares, directing the steps of a people who traded the divine promise for visible security. But the greatest project was still to come. The idea was not born overnight, but sprang from a collective fear and a personal ambition. The memory of the flood still lingered among the elders, and Nimrod knew how to exploit that fear. He declared, "If we build a tower so high that it reaches the heavens, we will be safe. If another flood comes, we can take refuge there. And if we remain united, no one will be able to scatter us." Words that sounded logical, but at their root concealed rebellion. For God had already promised never again to destroy the earth with waters. The rainbow was still there, shining after every rain. The tower, therefore, was not a necessity. It was not only the search for security, it was the search for glory. The tower would be a symbol of human greatness, a monument of self-sufficiency. With every brick laid, the heart drifted further from the command of God, and Nimrod, the center of it all, fueled this pride. He did not want his name remembered only as the founder of cities, but as the man who dared to build a path to heaven. Picture the scene on the plain of Shinar. Multitudes gathered, men cutting stone, women and children carrying materials. Thousands united in a single goal. The sound of hammers echoed, dust rose, and the tower grew. It was the triumph of human engineering, but also the triumph of disobedience. And every brick molded from clay and baked in furnaces was not just mud. It was a symbol of unbelief. For instead of trusting the Creator, they trusted in blocks of stone raised by mortal hands. Here we must pause for reflection. How often do we also seek to build our own towers, projects of security, careers, achievements, riches, all that seems to promise stability, but at its core reveals a heart afraid to depend fully on God. The Tower of Babel is still raised, silently every time pride replaces faith. Amid this progress, there were still those who remembered the divine order: be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. But their voices were drowned out by the enthusiasm of the crowd. The divine promise seemed distant in the face of the visible walls rising before them. Nimrod had conquered not only their obedience, but also the heart of the majority. He knew that the higher the tower grew, the stronger the people's unity around him would become. The project was not only architectural, but spiritual. Ancient traditions record that the tower was also planned as a center of worship, a place where the first seeds of idolatry would take form. Rooms were designed for observing the skies and venerating the forces of nature. Rebellion against God was being turned into an alternative religion, a faith built upon human pride. And here lies the irony. While they believed they were getting closer to heaven, they were, in reality, moving farther away. While they lifted walls of stone, they were also raising barriers between themselves and the Creator. Nimrod, with his eyes fixed on human glory, became the symbol of what happens when the human heart decides it can be greater than obedience. But the question is inevitable. How far would this project go? The higher the tower rose, the greater the people's confidence in themselves became. What they did not realize was that heaven was not watching in silence. God saw every stone laid, every brick molded, every heart inflamed with pride. And what would come next would prove that no matter how high the tower climbed, it could never stand against the Most High. The sound of hammers echoed without rest. Day after day, the tower rose higher, as if it could truly challenge heaven itself. The people, united in pride, celebrated their own work. There was laughter, there were songs of victory. There was an almost unshakable confidence in what they were building. The tower could already be seen from a great distance, like a monument to human power. Nimrod looked at it with satisfaction. For him, this work would be eternal, and his glory immortalized. But while men saw greatness, heaven saw fragility. The scriptures say that the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men built. What a striking contrast! What appeared immense to humanity was so small before the divine majesty that the Creator had to come down to observe it. The entire scene carried irony to heaven. The monumental work was nothing more than a pile of bricks. The problem, however, was not the construction itself, but the spirit that fed it. The tower was the ripe fruit of a rebellious heart. It was the response of a generation that chose to distrust the promise of the rainbow and to seek security in its own hands. It was the symbol of rejecting God's command to fill the earth. It was the exaltation of man above the God who had created them. The human heart is easily deceived by the appearance of success. The tower seemed invincible, and the city impenetrable. But no project prospers when it is built on pride. God saw that the unity of that people, far from being a blessing, was a danger. Behold, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. And now, nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Those words did not express admiration, but warning. What united that people was not faith, but rebellion. And here is a lesson that crosses the centuries. Unity can be strength, or it can be a trap. When it is founded on God, it brings life, peace, and hope. But when it is rooted in pride, it becomes an instrument of destruction. Nimrod had achieved what he wanted. A people united, dedicated, committed. But he was leading them all away from the Creator. And then heaven made a decision. It would not come with fire, nor with another flood. It would not come through natural catastrophe. The blow that would destroy the tower would not be stone or lightning. It would be a simple and brilliant intervention. The confusion of languages. Picture the scene. Workers side by side, lifting blocks, asking for tools, organizing tasks. Suddenly, one no longer understands the other. One asks for bricks, the other brings clay. One calls for the hammer, the other brings water. Faces filled with bewilderment, voices rising, shouts of anger. Little by little, the construction site turned into chaos. Laughter broke out among some, frustration among others. Words sounded like meaningless noises. Fights erupted, mistrust spread, and soon no one could cooperate any longer. The very language that once united them had become an insurmountable barrier. Human pride was defeated not by weapons, but by syllables. And how often does God not need to tear down our projects by force? He simply allows the confusion of our own hearts to do the work. How often do we seek unity around the wrong things? And sooner or later, discord exposes that we were on the wrong path. Babel did not fall for lack of resources. It fell because God showed the futility of a plan without him. The project that was supposed to reach heaven turned into ruins. The unfinished tower, imposing and yet useless, became an eternal memorial to human folly. What was supposed to be a monument to Nimrod's glory became a symbol of human limitation before the divine will. The name they had longed to build for themselves was lost in the confusion. But what impresses most is the mercy of God in this act. He could have destroyed them all, could have consumed the city with fire. But he chose only to scatter. The confusion of languages was not only judgment, but also protection. If that unity in rebellion had continued, apostasy would have grown to the point of capturing even more hearts. By dispersing the people, God interrupted a greater evil. The scattering was, in truth, grace joined with discipline. And what about us? How do we see this today? Perhaps we are not building towers of stone, but how often do we raise our own projects to replace dependence on God? How often do we pursue our own glory, trying to erect monuments of our strength? Babel is still being built whenever we choose pride over faith in the end. Heaven showed that there is no tower capable of replacing the presence of God. What men believed to be invincible dissolved into confusion. What looked like greatness crumbled into dust. The message remains clear. No human work prospers when it is built in rebellion against the great Creator. The construction site, which only days before had vibrated with a rhythm of tools, was now a stage of confusion. Men shouted at one another, but they no longer understood. What had once been unity had turned into strangeness. Hammers fell to the ground. Bricks were dropped. Commands were thrown into the air without any response. The one asking for water was given mud. The one calling for stone was handed wood. It was as if the very air had changed, turning words into disconnected sounds. At first, many laughed, thinking it was just a temporary misunderstanding. But soon laughter turned into frustration, and frustration into anger. Those who once worked side by side began to argue, shove, and accuse each other. The noise of construction gave way to cries of despair. As the hours passed, something began to happen. Small groups started forming in the midst of the chaos. People who could still understand one another naturally drew close. It was as if language were an invisible thread binding them together. Those who still shared words clung to each other, and from their distinct groups were born. For some, it was relief. For others, despair. Families embraced with tears. Marriages were divided. Friendships dissolved into glances of incomprehension. The one who only yesterday was an inseparable companion now felt like a foreigner. The streets of Babel filled with silent farewells. Desperate gestures tried to replace the absence of words. Many embraced for the last time, fully aware they would never again share the same language. It was the deepest rupture humanity had ever experienced, and so the dispersion began. Entire groups moved away, taking with them the language they shared. Some followed rivers, searching for fertile lands. Others walked toward the mountains. Some went north, others south. Every step was an echo of the command they had rejected: fill the earth from above. The scene was striking. The great plain of Shinar, once a single people, now spreading into multitudes, each with its own tongue, each with its own destiny. The tower remained unfinished, a silent monument to human folly. The name they had wanted to claim was lost. Babel no longer meant glory, but confusion. But what happened next engraved that day even deeper into memory. When the confusion had already spread and the groups were moving away, the heavens lit up. Intense lightning tore across the sky and struck the top of the tower. The thunder rolled over the plain. Stones tumbled violently, and part of the construction collapsed before the astonished eyes of the builders. The monument that was meant to reach the heavens was shattered by the very voice of heaven. The people stood frozen. There was no denying it. This was no accident. It was the hand of God intervening clearly. The tower that was to be remembered as human pride now stood as a memorial of defeat. In that moment, all knew there was indeed a Lord who rules in heaven, and that no one can defy him with impunity. The news spread quickly. Fear gripped every heart, but with the fear came certainty that the Almighty had spoken. Many fell to their knees. Others fled in terror. Nimrod, who had dreamed of eternal glory, now watched his work crumble. The tower that was supposed to mark his name had become a reminder of divine intervention. And here is the eternal lesson. When man exalts himself against God, he does not need armies or disasters to be defeated. A single word, a gesture, a flash of lightning from heaven is enough. Babel fell not because resources ran out, but because it lacked a foundation. It was pride stacked in bricks, ambition molded in clay, and none of it can stand before the Creator as they dispersed. The peoples carried with them not only a new language, but also a deep mark. Each family remembered the confusion. Each group carried in memory the lightning that split the sky. It was impossible to forget, and thus future generations would hear the tale. The tower that was meant to reach heaven ended in ruins, and its name, Babel, became synonymous with confusion. The diversity of languages and cultures we know today was born that day. But above all, a lesson was born. Unity without God is always destined for ruin. What men tried to build by force, God broke by His word. And true unity would only be restored centuries later, when the Holy Spirit descended at Pentecost and, once again, among many languages, all understood the same message: Jesus Christ is Lord. The dust of the fallen tower still lingered over the plain of Shinar. The thunder of the lightning and the crash of the collapsing stones remained vivid in everyone's memory. Groups were dispersing in every direction, their voices echoing in tongues no one else could understand. But in the middle of it all stood one man in silence: Nimrod, the mighty hunter, the founder of cities. The man who had once inspired multitudes now watched his great dream crumble before his eyes. For him, it was not only the tower that had fallen. It was his name, his glory, his ambition. The monument that was meant to immortalize him had become the public proof of his defeat. The very people who had once gathered around him were now leaving in fragmented groups, each following a different path. He who had promised unity, safety, and greatness now stood powerless before the scattering. Nimrod could not deny what had happened. The confusion of languages was no accident. The lightning that shattered the top of the tower was no coincidence. Even he, with all his arrogance, knew he was facing something far greater. For the first time, his proud gaze faltered, acknowledging that heaven had answered. But to acknowledge was not the same as to surrender. His heart was torn between the evidence of divine intervention and his stubborn will to cling to pride. Those who had once trusted him now looked at him with disappointment. Many murmured, others avoided him altogether. Some whispered accusations. It was your pride that brought us to this confusion. If we had trusted in the God of Noah, none of this would have happened. Nimrod heard those words like daggers. His promise of security had turned into ruin, and his leadership into shame. His silence hid an inner battle. Part of him wanted to admit that the Lord of Heaven had triumphed, but another part refused to give up control. He did not want to be remembered as defeated, did not want to accept that his power was limited. And so, even in the face of undeniable evidence, his choice was to cling to pride. And here lies a question that confronts us as well. How often do we react the same way? How many times does God tear down our towers to show us our dependence on Him, and yet we resist? How many times do we insist on repeating mistakes rather than humbling ourselves and starting again on the right path. Nimrod is the living portrait of the human heart that recognizes the hand of God, yet refuses to yield to it. In time, Nimrod continued founding cities. Nineveh and other strongholds would carry his mark, but now his name was stained. He was not only the founder of kingdoms, he was also the man who had defied heaven and lost. His human glory had turned into a bitter memory. He who had dreamed of uniting humanity under his voice now saw it divided into peoples and nations. And his disappointment was not merely personal, it was spiritual. Nimrod rejected God's promise in the rainbow. He chose the security of walls over the trust of the Creator, the pursuit of self-exaltation over obedience. Each one of those choices dragged him deeper into defeat. His hardened heart kept him from repentance. Instead, he plunged further into idolatry, creating systems of worship that would lead God's people astray for centuries to come. This is the great irony of Nimrod's life. He wanted to be remembered forever, and indeed he was, but not as a hero, rather as a symbol of pride and rebellion. The name he tried to magnify became an eternal warning engraved in history. Babel is not celebrated as triumph. It is remembered as confusion, and Nimrod is not exalted as a savior, but pointed out as the example of what happens when a man chooses to rise against the Lord. And here is the great lesson. Nimrod's end shows us that no human ambition, no matter how great, can replace the will of God. Pride may raise walls, but sooner or later they collapse. Glory may raise towers, but they do not reach heaven. A man may gather multitudes, but he cannot silence the voice of the Creator. Nimrod died as he lived, stubborn, proud, marked by his own error. His legacy was not only the tower that fell, but the idolatry he spread, the spirit of independence that poisoned generations. He planted seeds of rebellion that would sprout in future empires, from Babylon to the ends of the earth. But in the end, his story remains an eternal reminder that no one can defy God and come out victorious. And you, what would you do if you were in Nimrod's place? If your plans collapsed before your eyes, would you choose to humble yourself before God, or would you cling to pride? That is the question his life leaves us, because Nimrod's story is not just about a man in the distant past. It is about all of us every time we try to build towers with our own hands. The story of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel is still beating in our own time. It is not merely about ancient peoples on a distant plain. It is about pride, choices, and consequences that continue to shape humanity. A man, full of strength and charisma, chose to lean on his own glory instead of trusting in the promise of God. And the result was ruin, confusion, and separation. What we see in Babel is the portrait of the human heart when it tries to walk without the Creator. Nimrod believed he could secure safety by his own means. But he discovered that everything built outside the will of God is fragile. He longed for an eternal name, but the name he left behind was tied to shame. He wanted to raise a tower that touched heaven, but heaven answered with lightning that exposed his impotence. And if we look at ourselves, we realize the lesson is alive today. Every time we seek security only in wealth, fame, titles, or relationships, we are repeating the same logic of Babel. We do not need bricks to imitate Nimrod. All it takes is depending more on ourselves than on God. That is how modern towers arise. Plans that seem solid but collapse because they lack a spiritual foundation. But here is a truth that fills us with hope. God did not bring down Babel to destroy humanity, but to preserve it. The confusion of languages was not only judgment, it was also mercy. If that people had continued united in rebellion, evil would have spread even faster. The scattering was, in reality, an opportunity to begin again. And this is where the contrast appears. While Nimrod sought self-exaltation, God raised Abraham to walk by faith. Nimrod said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." God said to Abraham, "I will make your name great." One pursued immediate glory. The other received eternal promise. Two paths were set before humanity, and every generation continues to decide which one to walk. And you, which path are you following? Are you relying on your own projects or resting on the promises of the Creator? Are you living to build fleeting fame or to walk in obedience to the eternal God? Nimrod's story is not about stones that fell, but about hearts that must choose where to lay their foundations. If this message has spoken to your heart, subscribe to the channel to keep following content that strengthens faith. Leave your likes so that this word may reach more people. And share this video with someone who needs to reflect on the choices they are making. And write in the comments what part of this story spoke most deeply to you. I truly want to hear from you. The future does not belong to towers built on pride, but to hearts that surrender to the Lord. Nimrod left confusion. Abraham left hope. And today, you can decide on which side of the story you want to live.